Good evening, folks. Welcome to the MEPA remote meeting for the Malden River Works project. We'll get started in a few minutes. We're just waiting for folks to join. I want to give them some time to make their way into the meeting. So I'm going to stay muted. My name is Purvi Patel. If you could please pronounce that Purvi. Thank you for your patience. Jen, I'm going to give it another minute or two, and then we'll get started. Are you expecting anyone to join that isn't already here? Well, it looks like right now we have all project team members on the call, except for Eric Carlson from DCR. Welcome, Eric. And I'm not sure who else is here, maybe, that's not on the project team. Looks like there's 9 participants.
Is Jeff Mangle here?
Yeah, is everyone here from the project team?
Yeah, Jeff Nangle here.
Okay.
I think you're correct. It's all project team, other than Eric.
Other than, okay. All right. Well, we'll get started. It was it's 6:03, and welcome everyone. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded so that we can provide it to those that would have been interested in joining but weren't able to, and so we can provide this as a snapshot summary of the expanded ENF and the proposed environmental impact report that was submitted by the City of Malden and the partners for this project, Malden River Works. My name is Purvi Patel. Please pronounce that Purvi again. And this project is subject to the EIR, Environmental Impact Report, because of its proximity, either adjacent or within an environmental justice community. Okay, so these are based on the new legislation, the climate roadmap that was enacted in 2021. And so these are new regulations that have been promulgated by MEPA, and we want to make sure that we are actively including these populations into the public review process and public involvement, and making sure that the impacts are not disproportionate to these populations. Okay, so for those on the call, just Eric, I think everyone else is very familiar with the MEPA process, but for the purposes of recording, this project is subject to MEPA review because it exceeds thresholds which are listed in our regulations. This one specifically for work within tidelands, filled or flowed tidelands, of a certain size, and also requires a Chapter 91 license. Okay, so that's the twofold review that we're looking at. And MEPA is not a permitting process, but we do take action prior to the agencies acting. So Mass DEP in this case. Comments are due in writing on July 8th, which is a Friday, by 5 p.m. And there'll be a slide here at the end that will show you how you may submit comments by that deadline. And then the secretary will issue the certificate on July 15th, which is the following Friday. So 1 week after the comment deadline. The proponent has requested a rollover EIR. So they have submitted a pretty robust, fulsome document. And with that request, which has the EJ analysis and disclosure of the public involvement process. And so that's the request. I think we've had a discussion briefly about submitting a request for a single EIR in the event that the secretary does not grant that full rollover. So that may be forthcoming. I think I have sort of laid the reason, the rationale for MEPA review out. We're not, again, not a permitting process. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone on the project team? Eric's heard me give me the speech a number of times already. All right, so options to submit, to provide comment during this public meeting during this next 60 minutes or so would be to raise your hand or to put your question in the chat, or wait for a pause intermittently, which the proponent will grant. Okay, so those are the options for asking your questions. And Eric, we'll let you ask your question fairly quickly, since we don't want to keep you here all night in case you have that one or two questions that you have. Any questions at this point regarding MEPA review? Okay, great. So I'll leave it to you, Jen. If I missed anything, I'll just note it in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Purvi. I'll start the presentation on behalf of the project team. My name is Marie Law Adams, and I'm a member of Malden River Works project. Tonight, we're joined by Marcia Minong, the chair of the Malden River Works Steering Committee, Evan Spatrini from the city of Malden, Jen Ralstab, Amy Ball, and Nick Cohen from the Horsley Witten Group, and Jeff Nangle, the licensed site professional on the project. During the presentation, we're going to give an overview of the project, describe our past and ongoing public outreach and engagement, the design process, climate design strategies, environmental justice communities affected by the project, and permitting. And as Purvi said during the meeting, we will keep on mute in order to reduce background noise, use the raise hand tool when you want to speak or to enter a comment in the chat. And we are planning to pause between sections for questions. And so now I'm going to hand the floor over to Marcia Minong, the chair of the Malden River Works Steering Committee.
Thank you, Marie. I'm going to apologize for my voice. I'm a bit hoarse this evening, but I'll do my best. Thank you for this opportunity to present on behalf of the Malden River Works Steering Committee. Our project, Malden River Works for Waterfront Equity and Resilience, is about bringing together a new coalition of community leaders, environmental advocates, and government stakeholders to achieve a common goal, to create a climate resilient waterfront park on the Malden River that gives public access to all Malden residents. So just a bit about who is in Malden. We are a majority city with environmental justice populations dispersed in several communities throughout the city, including in close proximity to the project site. 45% of Malden's population was born outside of the US, and Malden High School is the state's most diverse public high school. We take pride in who we are and how our diverse cultures complement one another. Next. Next slide, please, thank you. How we began. The Norman B. Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism solicited international project proposals focused on equitable resilience. We formed a prize team along with Malden's Mayor, Gary Christensen, who was an ex officio member. We presented to the jury of international panelists at MIT. And in 2019, Malden River Works was awarded the first ever Leventhal Prize from MIT's Leventhal Center, inclusive of $100,000 to kickstart our project. And I can't tell you how invaluable that startup money was. Next. The Leventhal Prize sought proposals that made equity a central goal for resilience efforts, to develop physical design solutions that do not reinforce existing inequities and wouldn't create new ones. What we needed to do next was create the governance structure, determine exactly what it was going to be, and assemble the steering committee that was representative of Malden's diverse communities. Next. And that's what we did. We were intentional in seeking out a governance structure, namely the Malden River Works Steering Committee, that is inclusive of the diverse Malden population and underrepresented communities of color. Malden River Works for Waterfront Equity and Resilience offers an opportunity for eliminating barriers, encouraging inclusion, and promoting representation of multicultural people of color at the decision-making table. Next. This is a photo of our steering committee. And it was, we have a great group of people committed to this project. Next. So where is the location of this project? The site is a 5-acre parcel of land at 356 Commercial Street that is home to the DPW, Department of Public Works, and owned by the Malden Redevelopment Authority. Next. These are just a few slides giving you an overview of the site. The transformation of the DPW site into a civic waterfront space is envisioned basically in a two-part project. Next. This is a photo of the DPW from Commercial Street. Firstly, the first part of the project is redesigning the DPW operation for climate preparedness. I think that's improved stormwater management, spatial efficiency to make room for the waterfront project. Next. Again, this is another shot of our existing boathouse, which is, of course, going to change in the new design. The second part of the project is transforming a portion of the DPW parcel along the river into a climate resilient greenway park that will allow public access to the Malden River for residents, many of whom have lived in Malden their entire lives, yet never had access to the river. And as you know, public spaces are becoming increasingly important areas of recreation, as the typical indoor recreational spaces are closed or limited because of COVID. And this becomes even more important during the hot summer months, particularly for environmental justice communities who often lack economic stability and resources to help them mitigate the impacts of climate change. Next. Our design process was collaborative, inclusive, and sought to listen to as many voices as possible. Translation and interpretation were a necessary part of our outreach and public meeting process. And we held 4 public meetings, 3 surveys, had bi-monthly steering committee meetings. Next. To get to the design goals. So it was an interactive process. And eventually we came up with these 6 design goals: flexibility, connectivity, river access, inclusivity, nature, and celebrating Malden, reflecting the community stories, culture of Malden in the design of the park and the DPW. Next. These are some examples of outreach that we have accomplished, even though outreach is an ongoing process. This, for instance, was a free boating opportunity. And many people came out for the first time, got into canoes and got onto the Malden River. It was a great opportunity. Next. Again, another outreach. Here you see one, Friends of the Malden River having a barbecue, which we also used in an information session to inform people about the possibilities of what could happen at the Malden River. Another boating opportunity, and also there was a trash cleanup day. So there are many different ways that communities got involved in the project, and that is an ongoing process. Next. This is another example of our outreach. I think sometimes our outreach was about what was happening in the community members' lives, more so than what was happening in our particular project. In this instance, the Malden River Works wrote a letter of solidarity to Black Lives Matter. And this happened during the after the George Floyd murder. And it really resonated with community. So it was an important aspect of connecting with our community, not being transactional, but transformational. Next. Lastly, this is some examples of climate resilience. Our new park will also connect to the Mystic River Watershed Association's contiguous Greenway network, where neighboring cities, although already have visitors coming to their parks and enjoying recreational green space. So these are some examples of what could be an elevated walkway, which we'll also do, in nature-based water management elsewhere. I think I'm going to pause there and hand it back to Purvi.
Thank you so much, Marcia. That was so informative and really encouraging, and just wonderful to hear about the whole movement. And I would love to, I'm going to try to visit this nature-based water management in Toronto while I'm here. So that's really wonderful to see as well. I wanted to ask, I had a question, I'm totally blanked on it, but I'll come back to it. We can keep moving on. So I'm really happy that we're going to be recording this and providing it for those that are part of this. I'm really, really delighted to hear about all of the different ways that you've engaged with the public and the EJ community. It's really heartening. So we can keep moving on unless there's any questions about that initial process and the development of the design goal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Purvi and Marcia. So there are several environmental justice communities in Malden, Everett, and Medford located within 1 mile of the project location. Under the state's environmental justice criteria, the area includes minority populations, populations that experience English language isolation, and combinations of minority populations and lower than state median income, minority and English language isolation, and minority populations, English isolation, and lower than median income in combination. The communities neighboring the Malden River Works site are burdened by environmental injustices that come from a history of industrial uses along the Malden River, which affect residents to this day. Some of these negative impacts include lack of public access, as described by Marcia, and an excess of impervious surfaces that contribute to higher temperatures and urban flooding, increasing the risk from climate change. Malden residents have identified access to the river as a high priority in other planning initiatives, such as the Malden River Greenway plan that was mentioned earlier. The project incorporates the community's priorities by building an important part of the Malden River Greenway on the only city-owned parcel on the riverfront in Malden. So now I'm going to give an overview of our participatory design process, where we started with 3 alternative concepts for the new riverfront park space. Each of the design alternatives includes 4 main elements: a reorganized DPW yard to make space for the new park, incorporation of the Malden River Works or Malden River Greenway path across the site, pathways to Commercial Street for safe access to the river, and a new boathouse and dock for Malden High School's crew teams, as well as the community boating. The concept you see here is called River View because it focuses on creating a grassy stepped landscape-like amphitheater that would support views and enjoyment of the river. The Enjoy Nature concept is focused on bringing people to the river and restoring the river ecosystem with a natural riverbank and boardwalk over the water. And then the third concept that we looked at was called Flexible and centered on the idea of a large, flat, open lawn that can be used for organized events as well as informal gatherings. And so during the concept design process, we heard what were the likes, dislikes, and other comments on each of these concepts and found that Malden's communities tended to prefer the Enjoy Nature and Flexible concepts, and that the River View was too limiting in its use of the space. This is the concept design that was created in response to this feedback, which combines major aspects from the flexible scheme with the lawn that you see in the middle of the image and the Enjoy Nature scheme with the restored river's edge and fully accessible pathway to an extended public dock that provides access down to the river. It also keeps some of the sentiment of the River View concept by incorporating seating along the length of the accessible pathway to the river. The proposed location of the boathouse was also moved west at this time based on community feedback so that it would be farther away from the Malden River Greenway path to enhance a sense of openness and safety as people were using the path. These were some eye-level perspectives that were created at that time to create a sense of the look and feel of the park based on the design. So this is looking at the open lawn, the accessible pathway down to the river, and then some of the green stormwater infrastructure. The project team created a concept design report at the conclusion of the first year of the participatory process to hold ourselves accountable to the priorities and vision established by Malden's communities. And then as the design has been advancing past the concept stage, the project website at maldenriverworks.com is regularly updated to keep folks informed of progress. And so since major aspects of the physical design were established at the end of the concept design process, the Malden River Works team has shifted our outreach accordingly. We continue to hold community meetings to provide updates on the status of the design development and permitting process. We also continue to have bi-monthly steering committee meetings. And then to increase the reach of the project, the steering committee piloted a decentralized meeting strategy last spring to bring the project to community meetings already happening in Malden, reaching over 340 people, many of whom were new to the project. We've also started to hold events on the river. You can see a picture from a couple of weekends ago on the right to build community there and envision how the river will become a civic space. And then this winter, we will hold arts, culture, and education workshops to figure out how the project will reflect Malden's communities in those ways. The bottom row on this timeline shows our progress through design and engineering after the first year of the concept process. And then this is an updated view of the current design, which is really similar to the concept version, but with some small changes that have happened in the course of design development, such as the decision to reconfigure the accessible pathway to the river to avoid disturbing existing vegetation and shade trees that help reduce the heat island effect. And so that concludes the overview of the design process and current outreach. So I'm going to pause now and allow Purvi to take any questions.
Great. I don't have any questions. I did want to fully disclose that 2 years ago, I think it was 2021, I was one of the participants in the MVP review process that reviewed this project. So I have a lot of familiarity with it, and I see it as a really great blueprint for projects moving forward, and really just really delighted to see that there's more access. I know that you're probably going to get into environmental impacts. So I wanted to wait to ask questions, and once that was the next step. But thanks, Marie, for all of the sort of information regarding how the public was consulted with the different concepts for selecting this sort of amalgamation of designs that you now incorporate into the current design. So can you just tell me what the plan is regarding tree retention and tree, like tree planting?
Yeah, we're bringing, oh, Jen, would you like to answer? Okay.
No, I was just about to say we're about to talk about it. So we can keep going and then maybe
I'm happy, yeah, I'm happy to keep going with that. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no worries. So our current design, as the design process has done through the beginning of the process, really balances the activities of the DPW and their staff with the design of the public riverfront park and the desire of the community to make this public parcel and new open space welcoming and safe as a connection to the Malden River. The design formalizes the DPW yard activities, creating storage areas for materials, as you see here, including a covered salt storage area and parking areas for equipment and staff. The design also allows for resident access to a yard waste recycling area that is now going to be outside of the main operations area. The DPW yard is separated from the publicly accessible spaces through fencing and gates that will provide safety for the public and security for DPW. While the DPW's main entrance and exit on the northwest corner of the site will remain, an additional opening curb cut is proposed on the southwest corner of the site to allow for separate public access points to the parking areas proposed. This can also be used as a secondary egress point for the DPW staff and their equipment as necessary. Many of the features of the riverfront park that Marie mentioned that were developed through the concept design have stayed very similar. I'll just note a couple differences here. The parking lot at the front has been moved back from Commercial Street to make some space for a bioretention area and better orient the parking for access. There are some stone dust path connections and picnic tables that are proposed in the flexible lawn space to provide seating areas for those attending events. In addition, there are short granite walls at the edge of both the plaza and the lawn space that will provide both seating areas and additional landscaping areas. And then the pedestrian accessible pathway is now proposed as a switchback path with a non-accessible stone stairway to be able to preserve some of the larger canopy trees that exist on site. Next slide, please. Oh. Do you want to ask your question? Sorry.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I did want to ask a question while you're on that slide. Can you tell me what the site is to the north? And you can even bring it to the next slide, that's fine. My question relates to the discontinued area where there is a crosswalk along the northern stone dust pathway. Can you just remind me what is located to the north?
Yeah, so to the north, there's a property called that's owned by Combined Properties. It's a commercial, actually all the adjacent properties, both to the north and to the south, are commercial properties with parking areas. That's the immediate point there. There is a sidewalk, at least on this side, that people can access all the way down Commercial Street. That is, I believe, also has lighting and things of that nature for accessibility for people on foot or by bike.
So Jen, when people enter that northern access point, they can go straight to access the DPW building or the riverfront, or they can turn left into that northern site and crossing the crosswalk?
I'm trying to orient myself to where.
Well, I'm just turning my head so I can. So if you come in the northern access, and then if the Malden River is directly in front of you to the east, and you could turn at that northern. Yes, Marie's highlighting that crosswalk. Cars have access to that area?
That is correct. That's correct. Okay. Yes, that's an access. That's a driveway to a parking lot now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I wanted to understand why there's a crosswalk there and not a continuous.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yes.
Yes. It could have been clearer. Thank you.
No worries. So as Marie and Marcia described, one of the guiding goals of this project was climate resilience, or it continues to be climate resilience. The primary strategies that we used include adaptation, mitigation, and flexibility, of which you can see the callouts here for the different areas. I will highlight just some of these for kind of calling out these spaces. So we have set back DPW operations in the boathouse from the Malden River to be able to protect that infrastructure, equipment, and materials, and allow for adequate setback from for public activities and the river as well. We're also minimizing to the extent possible our offsite disposal of soils. We're proposing to the extent possible, again, proposing to keep in place or reuse soils to reduce our carbon footprint as a result of moving materials offsite. We are implementing nature-based solutions, including green stormwater infrastructure, native trees and native plants, as well as the living shoreline as a way to restore the ecological services to the site and improve the resilience for long-term success. And then lastly, as you can see in the riverfront area, we're creating these flexible open spaces that can be programmed for both active and passive recreation, accessible in the short term to the north and south by these pathways to the commercial street corridor. And in the long term, as Marie mentioned, the accessibility along the proposed Malden River Greenway that connects to the larger Mystic Greenway system. Next slide. So the stormwater design, as I said, uses nature-based strategies to improve water quality and storage for stormwater runoff. It incorporates both surface, which is represented in the slide kind of by a bluish color, and subsurface, which is represented on the slide by a sort of orangish color. Green infrastructure that provide both filtration and storage for the stormwater. And as I mentioned, it includes bioretention, some swales, step pool outfalls, which are on the Malden River side, and also uses permeable pavement at the plaza area. It incorporates the living shoreline along the Malden River as well to restore and enhance the native species and also support biodiversity and wildlife. The use of the subsurface chambers, water quality units, and overflow structures, which are located within the DPW yard, provide treatment of runoff and storage of water without impacting the day-to-day operations. In contrast, in the riverfront park and in the open space, we really tried to utilize surface practice and visible uses of nature-based solutions as preferred opportunities to highlight water and stormwater and plants as valuable resources to the community. No infiltration is proposed on the site due to the existing soil contamination from historical issues, as Marie discussed. Instead, these stormwater practices will be lined and water will be directed towards drainage pipes and outfalls. Our team, has worked with the city's licensed site professional, Jeff Nangle, who's on this call, to develop appropriate soil capping strategies that differ depending on the proposed uses for the site. Again, we have sort of public spaces, right, and some that are not really open to the public. And those capping strategies vary between hardscape to using of geotextiles to using of planted barriers and clean soil. And we are working through that with the city's LSP through the process to develop those strategies. Next slide, please. We have a robust planting design, and in our design, we're utilizing creating 9 distinct native plant communities, or what we're referring to as ecozones. You can see them on this slide in these various shades of color or hatching. The objective of the planting plan is to increase the ecological services, including the preservation of some of the healthy existing trees that are on site and the addition of more than 200 new trees, including saplings and plantings. Each plant community is comprised of carefully selected native plants that support the ecosystem of the site and the river system, increasing and improving life for insects, birds, and animals. Go to the next slide, please. This diagrammatic section includes a visual of 7 of the 9 ecological niches on site. In addition to the wildlife habitat, these selections provide for seasonal interest for visitors. So really trying to, again, engage the public at the site at various levels, all the way from entry point at Commercial Street back to the riverfront area at Malden. I'll also note here that in addition to providing these services, the tree canopy where we're planting it really provides an opportunity as a buffer to create sort of a capture of air particulate matter. So from the operations of the DPW DPW yard, as well as sort of a visual and noise barrier, although we are encouraging opportunities at various locations to have the public interact or at least observe the DPW activities to the extent possible. Next slide. The nature-based approaches that we're using on site, I've already touched on them. I just wanted to show some pictures here of what they might look like. These approaches utilize pretreatment, such as sediment forebays, to treat, remove some of the sediment and debris from the water before entering these. And once in is also the step pool outfall. Native plants and soil really filter the runoff. Also with the step pool, we use rocks and boulders to help slow the water before it exits the site and enters the Malden River. Next slide. I wanted to highlight also the living shoreline techniques that we're incorporating. Living shorelines use natural, native, and live staking to protect the riverbank from erosion by stabilizing the soils with the root systems. It also provides wildlife habitat, of which we've seen many while we've been on site. We're currently recommending the use of live staking that's dormant sort of woody cuttings, brush mattresses, and fascines, which are living branches sort of bundled together at the toe of the slope to protect from erosion. These strategies minimize the disturbance to the bank, and actually we are also recommending addressing the slope, which is pretty steep now, and to allow for more gentle slope that will, again, over the long term, stabilize the soil. Next slide, please. I just want to touch here on the dock design. So the dock design that we're proposing replaces the current temporary dock with a permanent structure that can be accessed in two ways, one by a wider boat ramp that is on the north side, and second by a narrower accessible pedestrian path dock. And this is going to be open and accessible to the public all year round. And the design is a 10-foot wide, 300-foot long structure, about that, with a wooden deck, as you can kind of see in the picture on the left. This is an example from another site on the Charles, which we're proposing sort of a sustainable wood, black locust that will be used as a local and sustainable option. We're suggesting that the dock be stabilized using stiff legs or basically a connection that would be placed on the shore and then connected to the dock. That would allow for some variability, but also stabilize for the public to use. And again, we are hoping that we are not intending to take this out during the winter months and instead allow people to use it, with the exception of perhaps maybe local crew team practices or events such as regattas. Next slide, please. As part of MEPA's protocol to address climate change, the project used the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, which is developed by the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, or RMAT, to assess the potential risks as well as the design standards and planning horizons for this project that look at sea level rise, extreme precipitation, and extreme heat, or urban heat island. On the screen here is a shot of the output of the tool, which here is showing you the various risk levels of each of the assets of the project, or that is proposed, or in some cases, some assets which are already on site that we're not actually changing. Next slide. So the design of this project actually started before the RMAT tool was available, but as we've mentioned many times through this presentation, our design process really reflects the guidelines of the climate resiliency and strategies are outlined by the tool. And this is just a snapshot here of the guidelines which are recommended through that tool and the various project design elements that meet those criteria. Next slide. I'm sorry, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and Jen, you're very responsive. I don't have it up more than a second before you noticed it.
Sure.
It's not like it's been there a minute. Can you talk about some of the newer data that's come out from the RMAT tool in terms of precipitation data and sea level rise data that you've incorporated into the design that's been like where there's been adjustments or refinements in the current design?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the project really started with a climate resiliency focus. So we have been, since our team has been working on it post concept, really utilizing the most up-to-date data. So and both up-to-date data, but also up-to-date guidance from the state. So we've been utilizing the NOAA 14 data plus data in terms of precipitation, which I know the RMAT tool uses or has incorporated both that data and other data sets, which are very comparable to that. Just as a point of comparison, our data that we used, which is again NOAA 14 actually plus, which is what is being recommended by Mass DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, through the new updated standards, which are still being worked on, but the data is actually very comparable. I would say it's not exactly the same, but very comparable. So in terms of how we've been looking at it for the last year or so prior to having run the final tool, it hasn't really changed the design at all. So in that way, we've sort of been moving forward just on the urban heat island as well. You know, we've been really doing our best to try to balance the needs obviously for the site, but also trying to incorporate to the extent possible native vegetation, including tree and tree canopy. And one of the things, as I think you asked the question early on, was how many trees are we keeping and how is that incorporated in the process? We have, that's one of the changes we actually did make quite early on between the concept and the design development processes, to really try to focus on keeping a lot of those larger diameter shady trees, especially on the river front area, because of the value that they provide in the short term as these newer plantings establish, and especially thinking about, again, wildlife habitat, cooling of the river, all of those things. We felt like it was a benefit to really keep those, even though we know that some of them are actually technically invasive species. So there's black locusts on site, for example, but we are keeping them because of their value to the community and the wildlife.
Great. And I know that the ENF indicates that you have submitted your notice of intent. Was an order of conditions issued? I know there's some lag time between that.
Correct. Yes, and Amy's got a couple of slides on that coming up. So you're gonna get that. But yes, it's just today. We got it today. So
okay, great. And so, can you just describe if the stormwater management system will be fully compliant with the SMS, or if it's to the extent practicable because it's a redevelopment site?
No, fully compliant. We are, we obviously, as we go through the process of looking at sort of as we work with the site's LSP in terms of soil contamination and thinking about how we integrate those things, and we're going to do our best, I think, to not maximize, but push the climate resiliency piece and the water management, stormwater management to the extent possible. But we are going to, that's a goal of ours, I should say my team, my design team. But there's always a balance, right? I think we would like to do more, but there's always cost implications to that. So.
And I just want to note at this point that there's no new alteration of land on site. There's actually a small reduction of impervious area on site, and that all of the resource area impacts are essentially associated with the shoreline improvements and the new dock to provide that public access and waterfront access. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to pause at this moment. I know Amy has the slides to show the wetlands impacts and everything. I know Eric will have questions regarding the floodplain at that point. So that's coming up, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So actually, I only have one more slide, and then
okay.
Amy's going to take over. Yeah. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as we've talked already, the public involvement process has been really, especially with the environmental justice community, has really been threaded throughout the design process and public outreach to ensure that the voices and the visions of the project at the origin are really continued is an integral part of the design. So we do feel like we have already, and we will continue to, as we'll show in a second, to reach out to these communities to be able to ensure that that process and that connection and relationship that has been established continues. As another part of the protocols, there is an analysis to evaluate potential burdens on these communities and also talk about the benefits that there could be by incorporating this project. So we have done that. We have used data, screening tools, and reports provided by the community and also the state and federal government to better evaluate what the risks, health risks, community risks are to this project. And again, we've found that we are not anticipating any adverse impacts, but rather there will be some temporary construction impacts to the community as a whole because it's the DPW yard and those activities. But also there's obviously noise and construction, and other things that are a result of construction that would need to be mitigated to the extent possible to not impact the community. In general, we think that this project as a whole is really going to lead to environmental, social, and climate resilience benefits for all of its residents, and particularly the adjacent environmental justice communities. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Amy Ball, my colleague, to talk about the permitting process.
Thanks, Jen. So one of the reasons we are before MEPA and a number of regulatory agencies is because we have a number of resource areas that are associated with the Malden River. They occupy roughly the eastern third of the property, starting with the river itself and the regulatory resource area of land under water bodies and waterways. At the upper end of that, we have an inland bank and extending 25 feet in for a densely developed community such as this. We have a riverfront area, and then there's also the 100-foot buffer zone that extends 100 feet from the top of the bank. So as you can see under existing conditions, quite a lot of the new proposed areas are all occurring within jurisdictional resources to one agency or another. One thing I didn't mention, and we just talked about that, it's not on the slide, most likely because you can't see it very well, but we also have the flood zone, which is at approximately elevation 4 feet. Next slide. So as we mentioned, there are a number of anticipated permits and approvals that are required before this project can move forward. Jen noted that we just today got our order of conditions from the Malden Conservation Commission. We are seeking another local permit from the city, the land disturbance and stormwater permit, which was submitted at the end of April, and that's still pending. The MEPA certificate, which is pending following the conclusion of the process that we're beginning this evening. And then for work within water, below the mean high water and within previously built highlands, we will need to acquire a Chapter 91 license for the Mass DEP Waterways Program. And we will need 2 approvals from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One is a general permit for working below the ordinary high water mark, and that is for work associated with the dock, as well as a number of the shoreline stabilization measures, which do extend below the ordinary high water. So the live machines, portions of the brush mattresses, all mitigated in nature, but they do fall within jurisdiction. And then the second permit or assessment that we need from the Army Corps of Engineers is a Section 4A assessment, which we understand from our conversations with the Army Corps will run concurrently with the general permit review. And that is associated with the federal navigation project within the river there's a shoaling area that's defined by the Corps. And that is one of the reasons we have selected the stiff arm or stiff leg attachments or footings for the proposed dock to accommodate some of those requests from the Army Corps. Next slide. Our anticipated permitting schedule will extend for quite some time. We started, with just the submittals, even for the ENF at the end of March, with some pre-screening notifications. And depending on, as Purvi was discussing at the beginning of the meeting, depending on how the outcome of this comment period goes, we may end up receiving the certificate of MEPA somewhere in the order of, July 15th for this initial process. And then again, depending on whether it becomes a rollover EIR or a single EIR, we may complete the MEPA process maybe as soon as the end of September. We have already received our notice of intent order of conditions from the Conservation Commission, and the waterways and Army Corps permits will extend out for several months. The waterways permitting process taking approximately a year from now. Next slide. So before I turn it back over to Jen, I don't know whether there are any comments that Purvi might like to take regarding the permitting and the resource areas.
Thank you, Amy. I'm happy to turn this over to Eric to ask this question. Thank you for your patience, Eric. I think this is very informative.
You're welcome. And yeah, I can be patient. I want to see the whole presentation. I only have a couple questions. And just by the way, I work for a Department of Conservation Recreation Flood Hazard Management Program. So that's what I'm interested in the flooding issues. I noted in the ENF that there is some impact, permanent impact to bordering land subject to flooding, 2,000 or so square feet. Now, is that impact strictly the stabilization that you've been describing?
Yes, Jen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it is associated with the live machine placement and the brush mattresses that all extend within that elevation 4.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, and are you being required to provide compensatory storage, or is that a non-issue on this site?
We have not been required to
Okay.
provide permits for storage. We believe that because it is live plant material, that the impacts to the boarding and subject to flooding are fairly
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. I was just curious if that was an issue with the order of conditions. And then you're building a dock there, and that's going to be in the floodplain, and I don't have any issues with that. But that was essentially it for floodplain impacts and stuff in the floodplain, as far as I could tell.
That's correct.
Correct? Okay. Well, that's all I have then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate that you're on the call.
You're welcome.
Make the time. Take care. Okay. And so I wanted to understand, so you've got your order of conditions, the appeal period has not closed yet. So we're going to treat this as if, we'll probably know before the conclusion of MEPA review, whether that appeal, it has been appealed or not, the order. So either way, we'll just be looking at this as if a superseding order was forthcoming, and then just at least look at the impacts and discuss them. So my last question regarding wetlands would be, have you had any discussions with Chapter 91 folks? You're right, Amy, it does take about a year to get the license. So that's one of your lengthier permit reviews, probably the only lengthy one that you have. So has there been any consultation with Chapter 91?
We have had some initial discussions with folks at Waterways pre-permitting. We plan to get those permits out in the next couple of weeks. and to get that review under a formal process.
And who did it? Was it that you spoke with? Was it Frank Carmina, Chrissy Hobbs?
It was Chrissy Hobbs.
Great. And so, did they identify any concerns that they had?
I don't recall there being any concerns other than, because we have both, in water work with the dock, the placement of the dock, as well as the bank stabilization, the shoreline stabilization. We also have some work in filled tidelands that doesn't really show on the plans terribly well on this slideshow. The sort of northeasternmost corner has one finger of filled tidelands, and so we will need to make sure that we address those, the conditions of that, and making sure that there's no adverse effects to the public's ability to navigate Fish and Fowl, which we think we're addressing through the design, we're reusing that area as part of one of the ramps toward the public dock.
Great. I am going to be reaching out to Chrissy just to understand if they have any outstanding concerns. They're really good about telling us ahead of time, so I would convey that information to you as well. I'm going to just read for your information. I'll pass this along. Kate Frew at DMF submitted a comment today or yesterday. She's reviewing the Malden River Works. DMF doesn't have any major concerns for the project. Example, recommending it, toy. The application says further investigations are anticipated for the dock replacement design. So she'll be curious to see that information when it's available. They would recommend that any in-water impacts associated with the proposed dock be minimized to the greatest extent possible. So I'll pass that on.
You can't
Pass on once I'm off this meeting. Are there any other questions regarding everyone here? Eric's asked all his questions. I don't have any other questions right now. You can please continue.
Yeah, so this is actually our closing slide. So we just wanted to highlight the sort of next steps of the process as we continue that are outside of or parallel to the permitting process. As Marie mentioned, there has been ongoing public outreach throughout the design process as we continue through this grant cycle, which is in a 2-year MVP action grant, which ends next year, June 2023. And as part of that process, the intent as we move away from regular project design updates and getting input from the public, we're really trying to do more on-site public outreach and really getting people more visible in terms of where the river is and the site itself, and getting some education as part of the process as we think about invasive species and native species and what does that mean, and thinking towards maintenance and things of that nature. So this coming August, we have an on-site stewardship workshop. There's another Project Mystique event, which is going to be in September. We actually just had one. That was an amazing event for the community. We do plan on having additional, as part of the second year of the MVP Action Grant, additional arts, culture, and educational workshops that will again go towards outreaching to the community and environmental justice populations. And then at the end of the design process, and hopefully following a majority of our permitting process, we'll provide another sort of formal public meeting where we'll provide an update on the design process and the permitting as well. As it relates to the design, we are currently sort of on hold as we get comments from the permitting agencies, but the city has applied for another MVP grant and continues to look for funding opportunities to go through the design process from where we're at now to construction documents. And so on the screen here just shows generally kind of what we're expecting in terms of the schedule, with the hope that we're starting bidding and construction in 2024. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The document is very fulsome, very robust, and the engagement is just wonderful to see. So I really appreciate that. It doesn't look like there's, anything you've missed in terms of the public involvement process. Just always encourage you to have, the adaptability to incorporate additional ways to reach out to the public, especially where, I didn't realize that the Malden High School was such a diverse high school. It's amazing. When I first came to the U.S. from Canada, I lived in Malden with my cousin, and it was just great. I loved it. It was wonderful. My last question before we close is, did you receive an ecological restoration order of conditions, or was it the more standard one?
It's a more standard one.
Okay. There was a language peppered in throughout, Amy, that it was an ecological restoration project. So I'm not sure if you went the route of actually acquiring the ecological restoration order.
Right. No, we didn't. It didn't meet the specific criteria of a capital ecological restoration project.
Okay.
But a lot of the project elements are going toward that that design.
Certainly, it didn't sound like you didn't need to even go that route, so you did receive your order.
Mm-hmm.
And that is my last question. So really good at getting this at an hour these days. These meetings are typically really well attended, and if you have any suggestions on how we could have more public participation, I would welcome that. We do the best we can with the short time frame, and hopefully the recording of this will help people. It's an hour, it'll be fairly easy to watch, and they'll get a good sense of what the project is and understand how they might comment if they can see this before the comment deadline. So we will conclude unless anyone has any last questions regarding MEPA's role, MEPA review, next steps. So again, Marie, one last question. I saw the rendering. Are they going to be doing anything to the DPW building similarly to like a artist, installation or painting, similar to what they were doing in Chelsea?
Yeah, there is a proposal that did come out of the community design process, that there's a desire for a mural on the building, and the city is taking that into consideration.
Okay, not MEPA related at all, but just a very interesting, thing to note.
Mm-hmm.
All right, want to really thank everyone, and I know the efforts that Marie, Amy, and Jen and the staff undertook to make sure that the translations for different components of written materials was providing oral, the oral translations if they were requested. And I know this isn't the most well-attended meeting, but I hope people can watch it later, and even after the MEPA review, hopefully this will be something informative. But I did really want to thank you for all the, the effort on your part. Thank you. So we'll conclude, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week and last few days of June. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.